Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Reform Scotland event. I'm Chris Deerin, the think tank's director. Nice to see you all here. If I could just ask anyone who hasn't muted themselves to do so, please, so we avoid any background noise. Regulars will know that we don't do many events that are based around novels for the simple reason that we're focused on the non-fictional world of policy and politics, which often stretches reality quite enough. But occasionally, a work of fiction comes along that crosses that divide and that asks important questions and that perhaps makes us stop and think. And I feel that an example of this is the book that we'll be discussing today, which is The Black Eden by Richard T. Kelly, which was released only yesterday by Faber. Not only Richard, who I think is one of Britain's most compelling novelists, not only has he taken on politics, but also the oil and gas industry, which is maybe another subject that hasn't often lent itself to successful art, apart from maybe JR and his treacherous Ewings back in Dallas. But Richard has really pulled off something special with The Black Eden. It tells a painstakingly researched story of the discovery of North Sea oil in the 1960s and through into the 1970s, and ends in the early 80s, and the deep consequences that this held for Scotland, both for personal and corporate fortunes that were made and sometimes lost again. Lives big and small were transformed for better and worse. Ancient and traditional communities suddenly found themselves tossed in this whirlwind of capitalist modernity that a lot of the investment brought. And not least, debates about Scottish identity and the nation's place in the Union were turbocharged. And that's a debate that, as we know, has not let up to this day. Richard has drilled down, if you'll excuse the pun, and struck a rich seam of drama, disruption, romance, in what maybe would have seemed like unlikely territory to me before I read the novel. In places, I think it calls to mind some of those old pastoral Scottish novels written by people like Lewis Grassic Gibbon or George Mackay Brown. In other parts, it's quite a dark thriller, and in still others, it's a beautifully rendered history lesson. The Big Issue has said that there won't be a finer Scottish novel published this year, and I know that because I wrote that review. But it interests me as well that Richard isn't a Scot. He grew up in Northern Ireland and the northeast of England. And so I'm really looking forward to today's chat about why he's written this book, the research that went into it, and what he's learned along the way. Perhaps what we might draw not just from history, but also for how we confront the changing energy climate today. So we'll have a chat, and then we'll take questions from you guys, which you'll know you can send using the chat function, so please take full advantage of that. So welcome, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Thank you for that very generous introduction also, and I'm delighted to be here.
The first question I've got is really quite a simple one. Your back catalogue is unusually diverse. You've written a biography of the Libertine Tory MP and diarist Alan Clark. You wrote a joint biography of Kevin Keegan and Kenny Dalglish. And you've written novels set in different parts of the UK. So what made you decide to write a novel set in Scotland and on this particular subject? What was it that caught your authorial imagination?
Well, I mean, my fictional bent has been towards what get called state of the nation novels, novels of church and state, affairs of public interest. And there's a long strand of that in English letters, and it never quite goes away. It's never the most popular show in town, perhaps, but and maybe in some ways it migrated a bit towards television in the end of the 20th century. And if we think about Alan Bleasdale and Peter Flannery's Our Friends in the North, it's that kind of thing. So, but I'd like to do that in fiction. Crusaders, the first novel, was very much about Newcastle, and also, if I can be so bold, about the post-industrial era in the UK and how people in Britain began to work for different types of living. Now, being from Tyneside originally, I always felt quite close to Scotland. I mean, literally sometimes childhood holidays spent there, and the language. My grandma called me Ben and Hinny in the same way that I would read in our Woolly comics and the Bruins and all that. I mean, these are superficial things, but they're all part of it. I think a little bit of a shared culture. And a lot of my father's generation, let's say, from Tyneside in the 70s, went out to the rigs. That's what they did. as you know, the shipyards and the coal got phased out. So it was always part of my cultural memory. And when I was thinking about another big subject in this country's national affairs, and one that maybe hadn't been treated, you know, in full frame, I got interested in the oil. And then, of course, we can get into this more, but the minute you start talking about oil, a bunch of metaphors and dramas just come in full tilt. So finding a story wasn't going to be hard. It was more like, what story to tell.
Mm. And it read to me like a book that had been very painstakingly researched, the sort of grasp of detail, not just of the politics and you know the economic impacts, but also the detail of how you find oil and what the rigs were like and whatever. Can you talk us through maybe the research that you carried out? I also know you made quite a few trips to the northeast of Scotland and further afield. And
yeah, again, I still have family members who spent their formative years on the rigs right through the 90s and the thousands. So there was no, it's not hard to get stories, you know. I mean, I've said this elsewhere this week, but if you go to Aberdeen now and walk around, and this is true, I think, for decades hence, you might be surprised to know there was an oil industry there. It's partly, I think, because of, you know, obviously a lot of things about oil are invisible, you know, invisible to the public eye. It's 200 miles offshore. Where the rigs and platforms are, it comes through pipes. So wanting to materialize it to the public eye, a little bit of a challenge, but the historical record is quite, you know, fascinating. I think Aberdeen, in its academy, as it were, through the universities and through projects there, it collected a lot of oral history, a lot of documentation. Just for, I can recommend to anyone interested in the area a wonderful journalist and novelist called Mervyn Jones. In the 70s, produced this chronicle called The Oil Rush, a piece of instant journalism. And it can't be conveyed in this form, but it's full of, he went with a photographer called Faye Godwin, and she documented it, you know, with wonderful photojournalism, images of Scotland in transition. So the actuality was readily available to me. But but after that, of course, the thing is, what kind of story are you going to tell? And it's called the Black Eden because Eden is not just one of our greatest metaphors in fiction, generally about temptation, corruption, etc. But if you look at most oil stories, it's in there somewhere, that metaphor. Something to do with a loss of innocence, and the idea that you pursue in pursuing gold and wealth and prospecting for that, you might lose some part of yourself. You might inflict something on the society that it didn't ask for. You know, there's this famous line that gets said in political economy about oil, the idea of a resource curse. If you've got oil under your land, you're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. The danger is that someone's going to come in, say that they know how to get it out there. The next thing that they're getting it out, spoiling your patch and taking all the profits elsewhere. That's a common theme in both the literature and the history of the subject.
And indeed, in your novel, you know, that certainly, I mean, I guess we knew this, but it comes across very, very clearly and entertainingly that there was a sense of the Wild West about those early days. And indeed, the people who come in and take the oil, a lot of them were quite rapacious Americans who'd had experience in Texas or elsewhere. And there's a few of them in your book. It was all about seat of the pants at the start, wasn't it?
It was, and to be fair, you know, Texan wildcatters as they were, people who were used to onshore drilling and just prospecting and traveling around, looking to dig a hole and see what was there. They were the obvious of candidates to come in and do the same to Scotland. I mean, to be fair, you know, it's a global business. The Saudis and the Russians, they all have their own share of it. The Americans and the Stetsons are the kind of villains that we're used to from Hollywood movies, and J.R. Ewing, as you mentioned, sort of inimitable figure of a lot of our youths. But yeah, I think in the social history of Aberdeen and how Scotland was changed, the images of Stetsons and cowboy boots on the streets on Union Street, you know, and the idea that there were suddenly steakhouses and diners in Aberdeen.
Yeah.
to serve the needs of the of this traveling show that came to town. And you can still see a little bit of that in Aberdeen now, to be fair.
And one of the most captivating things, I think, is life on the rigs, as you describe it, which, you know, is well, certainly then was, I mean, it probably still is dangerous, but then it was much more dangerous, and it was hard work, and there were different aspects to it that people were getting dragged into, and people who probably would never have had, you know, this stuff didn't exist as a career until the oil discovery came along. People who would probably been working the land or whatever suddenly found themselves as roustabouts on the rigs.
Yeah, extraordinary, transformative. Yeah, and of course that process was always going to be led by, if, for example, Texan expertise. You know, the role of the tool pusher on the rig is for anyone who knows that business. It is the person who makes everything happen. Like sometimes quite a martinet figure out there at sea, and a lot of characters in great sea stories on martinets, right? But as mentioned, you know, just like Geordie's headed to the rigs because there was knee work elsewhere. I think a lot of in different parts of Scotland where you had depressed economic conditions, there would be people who had skills that were going to be transferable, and they were going to have to find out that was where the jobs were, and they were going to have to learn really quick, and sometimes do things beneath them, like just hauling and shifting pipe, because, you know, drilling rigs just need, you know, length after length of pipe. But then also, of course, there were new ways to get skilled. I mean, there's two ways to look at it, really. It's extraordinarily dangerous work out there in the rigs. In the 70s, when there was a deliberate policy of having no health and safety, if at all possible. I mean, it was frightening, and I've got maximum respect for anybody who could hack those kind of conditions. At the same time, you look at it in the big materialist frame, an awful lot of Scots suddenly learned how to do things that were going to skill them up for a whole new economy. And that's sometimes what happens in capitalism. You know, you get these forced revolutions, but there's a useful outcropping from it. Oh, we can do new things that we didn't know we could do before. And I mean, you know, funnily enough, just one more metaphor for you. That when another thing that got me thinking about this story on a metaphorical level, I was rereading Norman Mailer's great nonfiction Fire on the Moon, about the moon landing. It's an extraordinary book, you know, and Mailer was an engineer, so he understood more about this than a lot of writers. And it's in '69 when men land on the moon and when oil struck in the North Sea. But in a way, the predicament of an astronaut up there, you know, setting foot on the moon. If you compare that to a diver in the North Sea, 200 miles off the coast, 500 meters down, stepping out of a capsule and being kept alive by umbilical cables that have got, you know, heat and air in them. That person to me is an astronaut on you know, breaching a new frontier in some way. And it's incredible to me how many brave souls did that because they, you know, they essentially had to, or were being told they had to.
And interesting timing on that. Obviously, we had the submersible that was lost on its journey to the Titanic recently. I think there's also, I don't know if it's quite a trend, but I've certainly read a few books recently that have taken that approach to life in the water, almost as you would to previously to outer space, sort of science fiction, but set in the ocean. So Martin McInnes, the Scottish author's new book, I've actually forgot what it's called now, but it's magnificent, and that's set both in outer space and in the depths of the sea. And then there's there's one about the octopus recently as well, which I've also forgotten. Anyway, there's definitely a few books being written that are looking down rather than up, and what we don't know about what's down there and how essential it is to who we are as a species and as a planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm quite sure, you know, as we know, we didn't need science fiction to tell us some of those people going out to outer space are looking for mineral wealth as well. Yeah. So the pursuit is analogous, you know.
Yes. The as you're saying that the jobs that this oil boom brought changed a lot of lives. Two of your main characters, Aaron and Robbie, are childhood friends, and they end up in careers, one on the rigs, one a geologist looking for oil. But they grow up in a heavily religious 1950s coastal village by the Dornoch Firth. And I wonder, in your research, what you discovered about the impact that the industry had on those communities, which were old and pastoral and heavily based around the church and yeah.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I've slightly altered some of the topography of the Scottish Northeast, but the story is kind of the conditions are kind of comparable. What were young men and young women going to do up there for work? Was there going to be an iron smelting factory? How many people was that going to employ? It wasn't going to be remotely the same as previous, heavy industry employers. Fishing was in decline. Obviously, that's a part of the Aberdeen story as well. And that environment. I mean, it's beautifully captured in the same part of the world in the novels of Jesse Kesson, for example. I think somewhat neglected Scottish writer. But you could see that there were problems, and you could also see that there were a certain people coming together, like economic task forces, you might call them now, but it was a recurrent thing at the time. What is the future? And the church had a big role in all of this as well. I think wanting to keep to look after its young people and ideally keep them in situ as well, which is the idea of the development of a region. So therefore, possibly a little bit suspicious of oil when the offer came for all sorts of reasons. It was going to mean incomers. And it would also perhaps mean, and this is dramatized through the story of Aaron and Robbie, as you say, that young people were going to leave, which is normally a kind of precondition for economic development, but in an area that's more settled, and again, coming from settled areas of the UK, I recognize that tension. And some of my Northern Irish, having spent a little bit of time there as a young person, the influence of the Presbyterian congregations over there is very strong in my mind, and the language of them, and so I didn't find it hard at all to project myself into the kind of environment where the Kirk has a powerful voice and social influence.
Well, and one of the things again that comes through in the novel is the the generational tensions that come out. So the elderly Kirk members and ministers are struggling with it, whereas perhaps the younger members of the congregation are looking at the opportunities that it's opening up. You've also got the Joe's father, who owns this fishing fleet that's been running for many decades and is hugely successful. But obviously the oil industry comes, and Joe, as a younger person, is thinking, well, how can we take advantage of this? Because the fishing industry is not really what it was.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there are three main strands in the story, and Easter Ross is the location for Aaron and Robbie's story, and then in Aberdeen you've got what I would call a succession story. People seem to like succession stories, I think. It's a common thing in business, what they call a succession problem. If it's going to get passed from father to son, let's say, what's the son going to do? And you didn't have to look very far for grist to that kind of story. It's quite fishing, and the future of fishing in Aberdeen was a vexed matter for a long time. The minute that the boats started coming in from the oil companies doing seismic research, going out into the fields, dynamiting underwater to try and pick up vibrations to make a map of the rock, the subsea rock stratigraphy. Well, that was killing fish, and so long before there was any realistic prospect of oil being struck, the fishermen of Aberdeen were saying this business is doing us injury, but it was about to do a lot more injury to once the oil was proven, and everybody suddenly got an idea what boats were going to yield the maximum value, and so that's dramatized. Yeah, when Joe Kildea takes on the family business from his father, the trawling business from his father Andrew, and says, "Well, I think we might want to do something different."
And that you mentioned earlier, that these moments of kind of, whether it's a sort of financial, economic, energy revolution that takes things away, but it also gives things. And again, one of the things that comes across partly through Joe's story is the opportunity for innovation, which has probably been a huge story of the Northeast ever since, in terms of better kit, slightly more innovative ways of doing things. Was that something you picked up in your research, that kind of the speed of iteration and the opportunities for locals there?
Yeah, totally. You know, what is a well-engineered solution? The reason why I admire engineers so much is that they've got that brain that confronted by a problem has to solve it. You know, and it just seemed to go every which way. Particularly, well, once the oil was struck, and then immediately, how are we going to get this stuff? How are we going to get it onshore? And how long is that going to take? It's a kind of fascinating problem for a novelist and somebody to dramatize. On one level, you have to understand it, how it actually worked, and then render it in a way that doesn't unduly waste the reader's time on the page. But it's so fascinating that you'd almost that you want to do it right. I mean, there's a fair bit of time spent in the novel, as you remember, when I'm sure it won't surprise readers to know, giving nothing away, that eventually one of the characters strikes oil, and that moment. And because it all was taking place offshore, I mean, if anybody who's seen a kind of older, like Hollywood oil movie where the drilling is happening onshore, the classic scene is the gusher, right? When the drill breaks through and you get this column, 200 feet in the air. And that it's dangerous, but it's exciting. That doesn't happen offshore. or if it happens offshore, you're in a lot of trouble. So the technology of what's called blowout prevention is had to be developed very quickly, and really, out there, the geologists are basically shoveling through mud and gravel to find just a streak, a sheen of oil. But I learned that one of the most important innovations in drilling that accelerated out in the North Sea. Ideally, when you drill, you take a core. You stop drilling and you put a different bit on the end of the drill, and you extract a bit of rock that you can take to a lab and examine. And you're meant to do that periodically. If you don't take your core at the right time, you can miss gold potentially. And there was a brilliant device that got particularly innovated by a company called Schlumberger, that you could take that ended that previous kind of situation, and you could take a core retrospectively by a little diamond cutter that expanded diamond wings down into the hole, and would cut from the side like a James Bond tool. And when I read that, I thought, that's a dramatic. I've got to use that. I've got to find a way to use that so that my hero can have his moment, because I can't do the gusher.
Yes. No, that's a great moment, actually. Even despite the lack of gusher and even jumping around, waving their Stetson in the air, it's
exactly. Yeah, that's what you dream of.
Terrific. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to ask you was about the individual characters. So there's a character, Ali Drummond, who I don't want to give too much away, but becomes a merchant banker. And he does bear something of a resemblance to Sir Angus Grossart, the late Sir Angus Grossart. Sadly, I laughed aloud when he talks about being a member of the Drummond party, because Angus often used to describe himself as a member of the Grossart party. Can you talk to us a bit about who's in there and who's not, and how much they're based on real characters, and how much they're obviously the authorial license comes in to spread it a bit?
Of course it is. I mean, anytime you're trying to write a story where you're borrowing from real events, so you're inventing, but you're looking for things that add plausibility and profundity, if possible, to what you're doing. And so you take little pieces. Sometimes, they say truth's stranger than fiction. And if you need a character to do a certain thing in your story, and you know that somebody did it in a way that's far more eloquent than everything you could ever come up with, then you're going to lean on that, I think, and be grateful for certain individuals having come before you. I think Somerset Maugham, a great old English writer, once said that it takes 6 people to make a character. It's a compositing process. You take a little bit here and a little bit there from life, and a little bit of yourself, and a little bit of people that you've read about in books. Mm-hmm. So when I knew I needed characters that represented trawler fishing, that represented the oil exploration out offshore, and I needed people to represent the extraordinary boon in Scottish finance, that the whole escapade enabled, then you know, Angus Grosset was standing really tall and all of that. Yeah, and that remark that you just cited, that thing about being a, you know, of the Grosset party. When someone says that, you feel the smack of genius.
He said it a lot. The self-interest was always there, and it's interesting then, I suppose, to broaden that a bit. That when you're writing about a historical reality, how do you strike the balance between accuracy and fictional storytelling? Because obviously the world is chaotic, and you have to bring a type of order to the narrative.
Yeah. It's good. You're dealing in myth and fable at a certain point, and I think so. You know, whatever the truth is, that's not going to make your story. It's an important distinction between nonfiction and fiction. You have to go into it. You have to find the poetry of the thing rather than the long read of it. I mean, if I can detour briefly into pretension or literary theory, that, you know, Bertolt Brecht, the great German, has got the greatest line on this, about how, you know, why we take real stories and try and make them fictional. He wrote a thing about staging Shakespeare's Coriolanus, and it was supposedly a dialogue between him and his theatre company about why they were going to do this project. But of course, Brecht actually plays all the parts. He just ventriloquizes his own voice. And he says, you know, why do we want to do a history play? Because we want to have the pleasure and give the pleasure of living a piece of illuminated history. I think that's a beautiful expression, illuminated history. So the history books exist, and now the dramatic imagination is going to try and shine a light on some areas. Not so much what happened, but what might have happened, or what might have been the poetic truth behind the thing. I think that's an expression of it that anyone can understand. And Brecht then has himself ask himself, well, that sounds a little bit sort of high flown, and he says, no, we all enjoy stories of the rise and fall of great individuals, the cunning of the oppressed, you know, the rags to riches, and that's what I mean by the mythic element of all stories. It's in this story too. You try and tap into a bit of that and understand that you're not writing a document that's there to be read as chapter and verse actuality.
Yeah, and actually the use of the word illumination also makes me think of medieval monks sitting with the Bible and using, you know, gold filigree and decorating them around to make it something more than just the words on the page.
Yeah. I mean, another thing I love, I don't know if you know or recall or attendees know Tony Kushner's play Angels in America, which was in the 1990s. It was a big canvas, I mean, inspired by the epidemic of AIDS, but it was a bit of a church and state dramatization of what went on there. And Kushner called that play a fantasia on national themes. And I loved that expression. I'd be desperate to steal it, you know, but rather I just want to pay homage to it. A fantasia on national themes. It invites the imagination into something that we all recognize, but maybe want to see a new side of. Excuse me.
We can't not talk about the political consequences of striking oil, because we're still living with them today. Pretty much all we're living with politically today in Scotland. You know, it's one of the most interesting characters in the book is Mark, who is a journalist, and he works for the Scotsman at one point. And as a journalist myself, it's a wonderful sort of encapsulation of that era in journalism, which before my time, but it was when the Scotsman was, you know, a grand paper. The editor of the Scotsman was a hugely grand figure, terrifying in his, you know, oak-lined office. If you were summoned to the office, you knew you were for it, sort of thing. It's very, very different days. But Mark also gets entangled in the politics that come out of that, because one of the things about the discovery of oil, of course, is that it leads to the rise in support for independence. Scotland now is potentially a very, very rich country with the oil off its coast, and the SNP fully capitalises on this. The slogan "It's Scotland's oil" still with us today, but originated from that point. So, did you research the politics of it much as you were?
Oh yeah, I took a crash course in the history of the Scottish National Party, which, you know, I'm not to be glib, it is fascinating. And there's an awful lot of schemes there, and an awful lot of things that were new to me. You know, the personalities that gave the party credit, you know, took in some directions, and others gave it credibility. You know, I did laugh. I think it was Magnus Magnusson that coined the derisive expression "Scots nattery" in the mid '60s, which just shows how easy for a broadcaster journalist of his, you know, caliber to easily disparage an idea. A couple of years later, Winnie Ewing in Hamilton, you know, and that was a great story, and I knew I wanted to put that in the back of a chapter, because those political upheavals excite me as a writer, and of course, with her recent passing, I was thinking of that anew. But yeah, I wanted to do justice to that movement and all the complexity of the ideas. Mark, the journalist you mentioned, of course, we meet him as a Labour Party member. He's a socialist for sure, though he comes from a background that he's slightly embarrassed by, but that's not uncommon. And something about the idea that he has a political idea, a socialist idea, that power wants to be exercised nearer to the people who decide it, and it leans him towards Scottish nationalism, also combined with a feeling that the way the oil industry has moved in to Scotland rapaciously, it makes him feel that, as he says in the book, if Scots are not going to feel the benefit of this materially in their lives, it's going to be trouble. So yeah, and the story goes the real action of the book, of course, ends round about the mid '70s. So there was a lot still to come, but I hope.
Yeah. And that momentum that they got behind the independence movement at that point, and when you see it being discussed in Parliament, there is very much the sense that although you've now got these new SNP members, that they are still not taken particularly seriously. They are kind of othered by the establishment, if you like. And I found, certainly when I started out as a journalist, which was kind of maybe the mid '90s, you know, and the SNP were still then something of, if not a you know, dismissed. They weren't taken as seriously as the Conservatives and the Labour Party were. They had 6 MPs. I remember going to meet them at Party HQ for the first time, and it was above a pawn shop in central Edinburgh, and you had Alex Salmond and Mike Russell and a few people who went on to be MSPs who were young people. And, you know, I think support for independence was probably about 25-30% then. But the support for the SNP was much, much lower than that. And it took a while, obviously, until really devolution, for them to burst through to the force that they are now, and the credibility that both they and the idea of independence have, which is that it could, of course it could happen.
Yeah.
So go on.
No, you get these interesting characters. You know, I mean, Gordon Wilson's a very interesting character. Willie Wolfe, interesting character. Margaret MacDonald. But sometimes, you know, political parties, particularly when they're trying to get underway, they can become they can seem like an odd assortment. You know, you can get strange bedfellows, and it can be hard to speak with one voice, which is partly a communications problem, partly a policy problem. And I mean, it occurs to me, this may seem like a broad brush, but you had a very talented Scottish generation of Labour politicians who reached their kind of apogee in the new Labour administration that maybe, you know, drew some of the talent that might otherwise have been sympathetic to at least, if you like, a socialist interpretation of Scottish nationalism. Again, the book stops just before. I was sorely tempted to have the young Gordon Brown wander into the back.
That would have been fun. Throwing things and shouting at people.
75. I think he published his red paper around about that.
Yeah. So I'm very keen to take questions from the audience, and I see that Alex Linklater has one. Are you there, Alex? Wonder if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Just thanks very much. That's absolutely brilliant. I'm just ordering the book as we speak. Sounds absolutely brilliant. I have to say, it's a brilliant subject. Can't believe it hasn't been done more, in a way. Just my question refers to something you said right at the beginning, comparing different kind of cultures of exploitative oil, rapacious oil cultures. You mentioned Texans, Saudis, Russians. I was just thinking, what's I'm really interested in the Statoil story. Know very little about it. How do you know enough to be able to compare the Scottish and the Norwegian stories?
I don't claim expertise in it, but to be honest, I think everybody does every day. The example of what Norway did with its share of the North Sea, I think is kind of it's very much abroad. I think a lot of Scots have a view, but also the world does. And whenever I said I was writing a book about North Sea oil, just to my circle of acquaintance, the usual answers were, "Oh, didn't the money all get spent on unemployment benefit?" Number one, and number two, didn't Norway do it brilliantly? Didn't they start, a national oil company and make a sovereign wealth fund? And why didn't we do that, etc.? That's what they did. Now there's a complicated story about, and of course the remorse about why that wasn't done. Certainly on the part, a lot of Tony Benn thought it should be done at the time back in the mid '70s. Successive Scottish politicians have rued that it wasn't done. The SNP, I know, have talked about the idea of a national renewable energy company for the next generation, so they don't make the same mistake again. So it's a study all of its own, I would say. It does occur to me that if you look at what the situation the UK was in the '60s, grievous balance of payments problem, the need to get the oil flowing ASAP for X many citizens. Norway is a country of 5 million people, and their scale, the scale of their thinking was a little bit different. But no, you make a very good point, and it's worth saying as well that possibly, certainly in film and television, Norway has reflected on its own North Sea story much more extensively than we have over here. Bill Forsyth's Local Hero is one of my favorite movies, and it's a masterpiece, and I love that man. It's a shame there's not more of them in a way. John McGrath's The Cheviot, The Stag and the Black Oil, and still has some kind of landmark prominence in fiction about North Sea, because he was onto that really early, and there is that plays like a fantasia on national themes. But it would be the Norwegians have been extremely self-reflective on their usage of the resource, and we in the UK, in Scotland, a little bit more conflicted maybe.
Well, that's interesting, because it takes us on to hopefully the next question. It's only marked as iPhone 57 about Aberdeen's historical connection to oil. Whoever you are, do you want to ask your question?
Hi there, Richard. Well, thanks for a fantastic talk. I was just really interested by Aberdeen's historical connection to oil, which you mentioned, alluded to a little bit earlier. In your opinion, has the city lost sight of its history, which seems like a vast and pretty bleak oversight on their part? And perhaps is it fair to suggest that Black Eden and literature more generally kind of forms part of an effort to acclaim that history?
Well, as a writer, I'm a visitor. I've kind of come there and put my boots down and got my notebook out. So I'm leery of trying to give any lessons. The oil was transformative of Aberdeen in a way that, one way to think about it is if you look at it now, if you go to Aberdeen now in search of you come into Europe's oil capital. Well, where is it? The harbour. The first time I arrived in Aberdeen, I went like a homing pigeon towards that harbour, and you can't get anywhere near the harbour anymore, because it's all given over to ferries and freight. And there's a wonderful museum just with a purchase on it that tells a little bit of this phenomenal maritime story of the city. Now, fishing and in that museum, you'll see images of a lost world that I try and describe at the start of the book. Hundreds of trawler boats coming into that harbour, unloading the catch of the day. You know, it's going to go left, right, and centre. Going to immediately head down to Billingsgate in London. Extraordinary industry. Now, all we know is, we can say for sure, is that nothing stays the same. You know? And you know, there's a lament for fishing that that I wanted to represent in the book, while at the same time another part of my head says, you know, you must move on. You have to find new ways to make a living. You know, I mentioned this again elsewhere this week, but Manny Shinwell, one of the great Labour politicians who represented both northeast England and northeast Scotland constituencies. Shinwell was very close to the people of Tyneside, but he wasn't averse to telling them hard truths. And he once said that if Newcastle, if all Newcastle had was coal, then it had nothing. You simply can't be dependent upon one way of living, one industry, etc. So it occurs to me that the simple answer is that Aberdeen, having changed enormously, has now, as I alluded to earlier, got this extraordinary capacity now to do things in the energy industry that is privileged and special. And if I was looking to the future of Aberdeen, and I think every politician who has a stake in this, as well as everybody who's interested in their future employment prospects, would be thinking about the next phase of energy, and being a new kind of energy capital. So my wish is for Aberdeen is just that happens.
Well, that takes us on beautifully, almost as if you meant it, to a question from Graham Blackett, a good friend of ours. Graham, are you with us?
Hi there. I should start by saying that this sounds fantastic, and I have also just ordered the book. But my question is, Scotland's got new natural resource opportunities, particularly offshore wind, which in the next 2 or 3 decades could contribute as much, perhaps even more, than the oil industry has to the Scottish economy. I guess, are there lessons we can learn from the oil story about the social impact this could have?
Did you say the social impact?
The social impacts, yes, whether positive or negative.
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to speak outside my expertise, but I know with wind and solar, Scotland's way ahead of the rest of the UK in terms of the extent to which it's deriving electricity from those, so it's already doing very well. Looked at enviously from the northeast, actually, because in the northeast of England, we spent a long time prevaricating about whether we could be the wind capital of the UK, but somebody has to move quick, and Scotland's way ahead there. I'm no expert. I do worry about wind and solar because sometimes the wind doesn't blow and sometimes the sun doesn't shine, and there are large scale renewables that I think require further or deserve further exploration. I mean, a lot of people talk about hydrogen, and of course, hydrogen is a great hope. It's very complicated, though. It's more tricky than we might wish for. Nuclear energy, of course, is the unbidden guest at the feast, but the French haven't worried about that at all. And that's their prime source of energy. Now, of course, the main thing about all of these industries is renewables, is that they employ a lot of people, but a lot less than oil and gas did, or indeed still do, if I have my figures right. I think you've got about 120,000 jobs currently dependent on oil and gas in Scotland, and about 25,000 on renewables. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but you can see it's a more amenable, certainly less polluting, more responsible means of energy generation. It's not the same kind of volume employer, but certainly not yet. Can it be? These are things, of course, that politicians have to be mindful of.
I suppose there's just thinking about that you talked about, we talked about those early days and just the innovation that flowed fast because it was a relatively new technology. People were finding more efficient ways to do things, and that's kind of the stage we're at with renewables in the sense. So I meet lots of people who are developing different types of product in Scotland, and it may be around heat pumps, it may be around hydrogen, it may be around onshore or offshore wind. But actually, the excitement, although obviously the reason we're doing it in a sense is terrifying, but nevertheless, the sort of scientific possibilities are really thrilling, and great minds being put to it. And the oil majors themselves obviously are investing in this now because they see that as their future. It's only going to go one way. So
yeah, they're not daft. Of course
No.
they're not. And no, you're right, Chris. I feel the same. I get really excited by this stuff just as a layman reading around. Just last week, I read something about geothermal energy, hot rocks. The idea that you can take heat from that with and you're not extracting anything either. You're just convecting or conducting. And that's been it's been like a rumor in the popular consciousness for a while. But I think there's been a substantial leap. And hot rocks are everywhere potentially, So things like that, are quite thrilling. Whereas hydrogen batteries, I'm glad I'm not cracking my head over how to roll that out, And also, I have some sympathy for politicians on this score as well, because once you set the carbon zero date, and then you start moving towards that. Dreamed of date, and of course there's other people who want it to be a cliff edge. That gets very complicated about how you meet your obligations and also keep the lights on.
Well, according to Keir Starmer, it's going to be 2030 now, so we're all going to have to get our skates on. I'm not entirely convinced that that's achievable.
One thing I never trust is people using round years or saying. I never ever believe.
Why not 2033?
Yeah. There's always a bit of realpolitik in it. Yeah, I'm often reminded it's the best thing he ever said. But Jean-Claude Juncker's remark. Well, I forget what it is in context of. He said, "We know how to do it. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it."
That's right.
And that applies also, I think, to the move to the low carbon future.
Almost every serious political reform you could imagine, I think.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Ian Marr, Ian, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, you mentioned the generation of roustabouts and their experience and how the transformation of life through the oil industry. I just wondered if in your research, did you gain any insight into the next generation, i.e. the kids and the grandkids of the roustabouts, and how have they got a different experience with economic opportunities, where their expectations in life changed by the experience of their parents? And the reason I asked the question, I used to work in youth work in Aberdeen, and quite a number of youngsters in areas, particularly in areas of deprivation, would say, well, I don't need qualification. My dad didn't have any, and he got on okay. So did you come across that kind of thing, and any impact it had?
The simple answer is no, because I was mining the memories of that older generation who are quite a bit older now. But it's fascinating what you say that kids somehow was it the example of their parents' success without qualifications, or was it also the idea that they'd made a livelihood, they'd made some money that they could give to their kids, or were the kids being deliberately sort of neglectful of the idea that they were going to have to make their own living? What did you hear on that score?
Sorry, I think it was probably the latter. They felt that they could make their parents, their grandparents in some cases, made a really good living without any need for any paper qualification, without needing any kind of academic achievement in that sense. And I just wonder what impact that's having on a new generation coming through, and there'll be a very different generation. You said yourself the renewables is a vastly smaller employment base than the oil industry ever had.
Yeah, you see, that's another succession problem, the disincentive that occurs when money suddenly comes in, and a lot of people who did I wouldn't say unskilled, but if you were changing pipe on a rig, that was a difficult and dangerous job, and you were well paid for it and so forth. So a lot of people could do quite well quite quick. But if you're talking about jobs that are going to require more sophisticated marine engineering, an understanding of such processes and qualifications are so important. And it would be sad. I mean, I did detect there was a series, and it's slightly represented in the book. It's in the background. Immediately, an effort on the part of the industry to give something back and establish, you know, institutes of marine research and petroleum geology, and a lot of academics who got involved in the industry took that as their quid pro quo for consultancies. Like, yeah, how about we start a department? How about we start an institute? And ideally, you would have wanted that to cascade through the generations, that Aberdeen should be, you know, and Scotland more broadly, as a great place to learn the marine engineering of the future, and that it should be exciting to young people as well. That's why if the oil story, if the amazing, it's one of the greatest stories ever told. It is like a bit, if that oil story in Scotland is somehow lost, and the incredible things that people achieved so fast is not celebrated, then a trick is being missed, I think, to inspire those generations who we want to do the extraordinary things to save our planet and our skins, so that we eat and don't fry up in the decades to come. I'm sorry to sound glib about it, but that's the Anthropocene world that we all confront. You gestured to it a bit yourself there, Chris.
If anyone has a last question, because we don't have much time left, please do send it through now. But I've got one sort of final question for you, Richard, which is, really, you're someone who lives in London, and you've written a book about Scotland, and in terms of the approach to energy. So a few years ago, Nicola Sturgeon, I think, was the first leader in the UK to describe, to call a climate emergency. And we saw recently Zach Goldsmith resigned as a government minister, saying that Rishi Sunak had shown no interest in energy and as it related to reducing climate change. Is there a sense, because up here, you know, it's a big part of the conversation, our politics, or at least the political culture, sits a bit to the left and a bit more progressive than certainly what we're getting from the Conservatives down south. I'm not making a value judgment there, that's just how it is. You know, so the focus on climate change, and obviously because of the opportunity of renewable energy, there's a great focus on that as well. How does it feel in London? Does it feel like the danger has been grasped, and that they are focused on the change that's needed? And obviously the Prime Minister in London is also operating on a global scale. They're going to these COP meetings and the rest, and agreeing deals with the President of the US and the President of China and other things.
Yeah, but they've all got their own interests as well, you know. Obviously, what Biden's doing with his IRA Act, you know, he's, you know, committing money, whatever it takes, in a way. Part of it maybe is to try and compensate and court those workers who lost their jobs to China and who voted for Trump, you know. And so, but there's an obvious example of the world's superpower spending big in order to facilitate that change. With Sunak, I mean, you know, I've heard it said he's, you know, a merchant banker at the heart, and it makes for an agreeable life for him, but that he his commitments to other possibilities might be more tenuous. We all, I think, remember David Cameron starting off on one foot and then becoming more associated with it, with a rather derogatory expression he made towards green policies. You know, again, I've got a mite of sympathy for them, because they represent us, and our consumption habits, I think, are changing a bit slower than anybody is actually admitting to. The people are doggedly determined to do the things that they want to do, and because they've been encouraged to for a long time, and so that is also, you know, it makes for a lukewarm agent of change. I think, you know, and Starmer, of course, got caught out, and he may have been caught out, I dare say, by a former leader of his party who was writing checks with his mouth that couldn't be. So there was one promise to borrow a lot of money, and then there was, oh no, we've got to get elected. And but do I doubt the sincerity of the conviction? No, I absolutely don't. I think, you know, people have got an extinction moment, an extinction fear in their head. I don't see it as the cliff edge that sometimes dominates some of the popular discourse and demonstrations. But I think we all know that if the planet keeps heating, if crops shrivel, if temperatures become unlivable, lots of people die. But also if you remove oil and gas immediately, and you know, there's no more fertilizers for crops and diesel for tractors, people are going to die too. It's a brutal way to say it, but this is a dilemma of politics. So the simple answer, Chris, yes, taken seriously. Yes, the devil on the shoulder says, but how do I get re-elected? And then also, how urgently are the people telling me, instructing me what to do? It's the other political defense that I'm not unreceptive to.
Well, we started with fiction and ended in the real world, but I can urge you all to get back to fiction and get wonderful book. As I said, there won't be a better Scottish novel. Oh, I need to get the hardback. I've got the Faber early.
I'll send you one.
Review copy. Thank you. Sign it as well. I urge you to read this book and also to read all of Richard's earlier books, which are splendid as well. You know, it's great. It's interesting that it took someone like you, Richard, from outside Scotland to come in and write this book, and it wasn't a Scottish author that did it.
I think there's a thing called critical distance that makes it easier in some ways, but it's there in the background in so much Scottish fiction, and I'm quite sure, you know, there's going to be more petro novels, as they're called, you know, coming in due course.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm delighted, and thank you for your questions and your consideration for the book, and thank you also to the people who've listened in and for your excellent questions also. It's a real treat for me to have this forum, so I'm grateful. That's
great. We wish you every success with the novel.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. All right. All the best.